So one day I was on YouTube looking for something new to watch, and I came across this mini N64 thing. And then the neurons started firing because, oh, look how cute. And I kinda sorta ended up in a mini console rabbit hole. So hey, yeah, I have a new very tiny hyperfixation, and today I'm gonna talk about it for a little bit, or at least the stuff I found interesting, like how the whole mini console trend started, how it got fumbled, and the really cool non-mega corporation scene for it that's brought it up too. Is the word indie? Indie maybe? So it's not going to be a deep dive into every mini console or anything like that, just the stuff that tickled my brain. That said, it basically started almost 10 years ago, all the way back in 2016. How the bleep was that 10 years ago? In 2016, I wasn't doing much in the way of gaming aside from the occasional lightly competitive family game of Super Smash Bros. I was a Kirby main, which I know is very on brand. But from what I understand, after a little research, the 1 to 2 years prior to the Nintendo Switch were a little rough for Nintendo. Well, aside from a little something called the NES Classic, which was a tiny plug-and-play console preloaded with 30 games, and which Nintendo admitted to having used to help bridge the gap between the end of the Wii U and the beginning of the Switch. I had zero idea this even existed until recently, but regardless of my ignorance, the NES Classic was a massive success that sold out almost immediately when it was released in November of 2016, and following shortly after was the SNES Classic in 2017, which was also very, very good. After the SNES Classic, Nintendo then moved away from plug-and-play retro consoles and toward retro game emulation on the Switch and eventually the Switch 2, which I have some feelings about, but we'll save that for another time, maybe, I don't know. But the impact the NES Classic had, and by that I mean all the money it made, led Nintendo's competitors to release their own mini consoles. Not that there hadn't been little plug-and-play things before, but the NES Classic was so successful it pretty clearly had an influence on some of the things that followed. One of the most notable being the PlayStation Classic in 2018, but let's just say it wasn't notable for being good, which is great news for me because, well, it made it more fun to learn about. The PlayStation Classic was like a little baby PS1 that came with 20 PlayStation 1 games, including no-brainers like Final Fantasy VII and Resident Evil, but for reasons I can't even begin to speculate on because what? Things like Crash Bandicoot, Tomb Raider, Spyro, completely ignored. So for that kind of thing, it received a lot of criticism, but that was just the first of a whole bunch of problems. You see, it wasn't just the game selection that kind of pissed people off. The gameplay experience itself was also pretty poor. To start with, the controllers bundled with the console didn't have analog sticks, which was kind of a confusing move because some of the games included are just straight up better with them. And speaking of the games, 9 of the 20 games included were PAL versions for some reason, which run slower than their NTSC counterparts. I'm not usually the most knowledgeable about the more technical aspects of some things, and so I didn't really even know the difference between NTSC and PAL, but from what I've read in my very hyper-focused search for knowledge, it goes like this. PAL versions of games update at 50 Hz as opposed to the NTSC versions, which update at 60 Hz, and the PlayStation Classic itself outputs at 60 Hz. And so basically, these games were running pretty funky because of all the Hertz stuff going on. What's super confusing though is apparently you can plug a USB keyboard into the PlayStation Classic, and by pressing literally one key, you can open up a menu and change the game regions to NTSC anyway, so okie dokie. If you thought the NTSC versions would all run really well though, you'd be wrong, because they don't. The PlayStation Classic started at a price of $99.99 USD, which is crazy given the quality, especially when you consider the NES Classic, a much better product, was $59.99. Sales were especially low in the US to the point retailers had to discount it repeatedly, all the way down to $20, which I thought was a little funny. It's actually kind of impressive how hard Sony fumbled this considering PlayStation emulation has been pretty great even as far back as the PSP. But I don't know, the short answer to why it all went the way it did probably has something to do with, you know, cashing in on a trend without putting in much effort. From what I've seen at least, it's a little more desirable now because it can be hacked, which means more games, but yeah. In 2019, Sega joined in and released the Sega Genesis Mini and later the Genesis Mini 2, which were both really well received for their performance and game selections and all that good stuff. They included Shining Force, which is like my #2 favorite game of all time, but I'm not here to talk about that. I'm here to talk about how in 2020, they then made the Game Gear Micro, which nobody was really asking for and was ultimately more of a novelty product for collectors than something actually useful. Side note, I know this isn't a console, it's a handheld, but I don't know, I'm including it because I want to talk about it, so sue me. As far as tiny goes, the Game Gear Micro was really tiny, smaller than a Game Boy Micro, and so a big complaint was that it simply wasn't comfortable to play on at all for long periods of time. But I mean, the main appeal was the novelty of how small it was, so I find that in particular a little silly to complain about. What was legitimately off-putting to me though was that Sega had come up with what I saw as a not-so-sneaky plan for selling more units. I love Sega, and I think they're very cool, and one of the less evil game companies out there. Nintendo kind of takes the cake with that, or at least their lawyers do. But the Game Gear Micro was, I don't know, I'm conflicted. It wasn't that the Game Gear Micro came in different colors, that's totally cool. What wasn't as cool was that each of the color variants had its own unique set of 4 games on it, with the more popular titles all being on separate versions. So in order to be able to play all the games on this particular device, you'd have to buy every version of the Game Gear Micro, which at an original price of about $50 a piece meant you'd be spending hundreds. I get it though, this is way more of a collectible than anything you'd realistically want to play on anyway, but I don't know, it still kind of rubbed me the wrong way. Why not just put all the games on each one, and why not include more games in general? It could have been way worse in technicality though, because each version of the Game Gear Micro was originally supposed to only have 1 game on it, which was later changed to 3, and finally changed to 4, so at least it's not 1. But just like with the PlayStation Classic, thankfully, the Game Gear Micro can be hacked now in order to play up to 42 games, which is obviously way better. But as a little warning, probably because of their more collectible nature and limited Japan-only release, they're pretty expensive now. But hey, if you have one, you can hack it if you feel like it. Even though official mini consoles have since gone out of style, the whole thing also kind of laid the groundwork for unofficial mini consoles, which are also way cooler. I have seen so many of these online, and just looking at them makes me very, very happy. You've literally got people putting like tiny functional Game Boy replicas on keychains. The Thummy is kinda one because it can play games, just not actual Game Boy games or anything as far as I can tell, but I'm pretty sure that's the tiniest handheld to ever exist, which is very cool. But then there's the FunKey S, which can play your favorite retro games. There's the Anbernic RG Nano, which is basically just the FunKey S, and they even use FunKey OS, but I'm not getting into that. And there's even these sketchy little bootleg looking things on AliExpress, but apparently they work pretty well. Aside from Game Boys, you can basically take a Raspberry Pi and make just about anything a mini console. People have put them in Dreamcast VMUs, and then there's that custom housing that looks just like an N64, just way tinier, and you just pop the Raspberry Pi in there, and there you go. In fact, I was originally just going to do a video where I put together the mini N64 or 64 Pi, because you know, I saw it and bought the stuff on impulse as per usual, but I just found all the mini console information I had been reading way too interesting and decided to just ramble on about it all for a bit instead. I'm personally very into the whole thing going on these days where people are just making sometimes comically small consoles and handhelds, because, as you know, if you've been around the channel for any period of time, I really like cute things, and this tiny stuff is very, very cute. And they're even cuter when there's not blatantly obvious corporate greed behind it all, because for the most part at least, I think people are making these things because they're just in it for the love of the making shit tiny because it's funny game, and I respect that wholeheartedly. So yeah, very cute things, and I want to buy all of them, and even if some of them sucked, well, at least it made for an interesting read. Anyways, if you enjoyed the video, consider liking and subscribing. Also, if you like live streams, follow me on Twitch where we get a little silly. And also let me know in the comments how you feel about the whole mini console thing. I kind of wish Nintendo at least would make more because I feel like they'd be unlikely to screw it up too bad, and a mini GameCube would be really adorable, but that's just me. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye!